Yeah.
About to go live, ladies and gentlemen. As you know, your host, MythVision Podcast, Derek Lambert here. And I'm going to get this intro here. Let's let some people flow in. Created this custom intro before. Make sure you guys go check out the debaters' YouTube channels and help support what they do. Obviously, this is going to be an exciting debate. Here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. For those of you who've become patron recently on MythVision Podcast, you're helping making this possible, obviously continuing with this channel and growing what we're doing, bringing you guys education, various scholars, different topics. And today we're going to have a debate. I'm really excited about this debate because I respect both of these gentlemen. I learn from both of these gentlemen, and there's so much to learn on both of their channels. Make sure you guys go check them out in the description, all of their plugs. And with that being said, let me start with a quote real quick from one of the wisest men. Not really. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. The Apostle Paul, 1 Corinthians 13:11. I love using that because really we're actually going to be diving into this text. But we once believed in a lot of these mythologies, or at least I know I did. And today, that's not going to be the issue. The issue really comes down to, did Jesus exist at all historically? And so, no further ado, we have our guest. We have John Gleason from Godless Engineer and Kamil Gregor from Kam and Kam YouTube channel. It's all in the description. I will hex you if you don't go subscribe and hit that bell and listen to what these guys have to say. So thank you guys for joining me. Can I hear you?
Thank you. Thank you for having me or us.
Thanks.
Yeah, I just figure I'd go ahead and introduce you guys, if you will, real quick. I wanted to let everyone know we're going to do a 12-minute opening statement from each of these guys. Kamil has taken the side that most probably there was a historical figure called Jesus sometime in the 1st century that this mythology built off of. And the opposite is that it's not really opposite, but nonetheless, it's mythicism. The idea that most probably, it's minimal mythicism, that there probably wasn't a Jesus and that it's probably some form of a celestial figure, a different explanation than it being a human guy on the ground in the 1st century. And so I have to read this real quick because Kamil, I'm going to let John introduce himself because he knows more than just I have his plug on the YouTube and such. But Kamil he studies ancient history and Greek philology at the Charles University in Prague, and is a host of the podcast Ante Portas. Am I saying that correct?
Podcast Ante Portas, yeah.
Ante Portas. Okay. And Kam YouTube channel, and he owns a lot of books. We had to add that. There's a lot of knowledge there, right? So, John, introduce yourself if you don't mind, brother, and let everybody know what they don't know already.
Well, I'm John Gleason. I run the Godless Engineer YouTube channel. I became a mythicist after I started investigating what evidence we do have for a historical Jesus. And I came out of that journey not being convinced that Jesus actually existed in history. And I've only learned, much more since then. So, you can find all of that information on whether or not Jesus existed in my app called Crestus. I have it in the app stores. It's on Apple and Android. You can go there. It does cost a little bit of money, but yes, thank you, Kamil. It does cost a little bit of money, but it's also backed by a lot of peer-reviewed research, not only from Richard Carrier, but as well as other scholars. It's very extensive in the information that I have in it. So if you want to learn more about mythicism, I highly suggest you get that app. Come visit me on Godless Engineer here on YouTube.
Thank you for that introduction. Guys, I guess who would like to go first? And then I'm going to back out when you guys, this is how it's going to work. 12-minute intro from one of you guys, 12-minute intro from the other. We're not going to do this as a formality, back and forth, intro this, intro that, a rebuttal here, rebuttal there. Open conversation after this 12-minute intro so our audience can ask questions. You guys, of course, super chats are always favored, and thanks for helping grow the channel. If you guys have a question to our panel, the people that are here debating, feel free to ask it, and we will get to Q&A, and we'll have a good time trying to discuss the matters and the issues between these ideas. I'm going to shut up. Ladies and gentlemen, go ahead. Which one of you guys want to start first?
Do you want to go first, John?
Well, I figured since you're in the affirmative that he did exist, it probably would be best
Oh, yeah,
for you
that
to go
makes
first.
sense. Okay, cool. So let me start. So thanks for organizing the debate. I think it's going to be really fun. First of all, I'm an atheist, so I obviously don't think that Jesus was a divine being or had any supernatural powers or was raised from the dead. So my position is not faith-based, it's just based. Instead, I will be arguing for so-called minimal historicity, which is just the idea that there was a religious leader named Jesus living in the 1st century Palestine, who, if we had a time machine, we could actually go talk to. He acquired some following during his life. Then he was arrested and executed, and some of his followers became convinced that he was an agent of God and continued to worship him even after his death. I'm not super confident about it. I would put my epistemic credence only at about 70%. Plus or minus 20% to give you some kind of confidence interval, right? Which means that on good days, I'm pretty agnostic about it. But then on bad days, I would be at about 90%, which is actually very high when we talk about ancient, history 2000 years removed. So why do I have that position? Well, there are two components of estimating a historical hypothesis, the prior probability and the expectedness of the evidence. So when it comes to the prior probability of Jesus' existence, I think it's very high. First of all, a guy existing 2000 years ago is not anything extraordinary, right? And we have a lot of examples of people like that, specifically in 1st century Palestine, and really almost no examples of people like that who are invented. And now you might think, okay, what about his supernatural powers? Surely the myths that are associated with him lower the prior, right? Well, that's definitely true in our current culture. For example, people with supernatural powers are usually fictional, right? So when historians find a Superman comic 2000 years from now, they will really have no reason to believe that there actually was a Clark Kent. But that's because when we write about superheroes today, we usually don't base them on real characters. That's like a literary convention that we have. But interestingly enough, and not many people know about this, but this convention is actually not true about antiquity. There is a large number of ancient figures with fantastical stories. Many of them are pretty similar to Jesus. For example, there are people who were believed to be incarnations of pre-existing beings like Romulus or Pythagoras. They were conceived by divine beings like Heracles or Plato. They performed amazing miracles like Asclepius or Vespasian. They returned from the dead like Theseus or Miltiades. They ascended to heaven to live among the gods like Oedipus or Julius Caesar. And they were worshipped as divine beings like Dionysus or Apollonius of Tyana. And interestingly enough, almost all of those characters actually existed. The only exceptions are characters who are depicted as living in a very distant sort of pre-archaic age. So why do we observe this pattern, right? Well, that's because in the ancient world, there was this really strong literary convention. When ancient authors wrote about fictional, fantastical characters, they usually didn't depict them as living in their own times and interacting with known historical figures. For example, Pilate, John the Baptist, or the high priest Caiaphas, right? The same way that we do it today with superheroes who crash land in Texas in 1950s, laser beam Joseph Stalin, and stuff like that. Instead, when ancient authors wrote about fantastical people, particularly about superhuman fictional people, they usually set those stories in a very distant pre-archaic age. For example, Seneca the Younger, who wrote in the 1st century, so he was roughly contemporary with the New Testament authors, wrote about gods and superhuman people with superhuman powers. But he didn't set those stories, let's say, in the time of Julius Caesar a generation ago. No, he writes about Jason and Medea, just like everyone else, right? And conversely, Horatius was again a roughly contemporary poet who actually did write about how the god Mercury became incarnated on Earth in his own time. But does that mean he invented a new fictional character? Of course not. He just talks about Augustus Caesar. And of course, there are some exceptions to this, but history is about probabilities and not about necessities. And by the way, this is true not only about ancient Greek and Roman literature, it's also true about ancient Jewish literature. So think about sort of the internal chronology of events in the Jewish Bible, right? So obviously, all of the characters who are depicted living in a very distant past are all fictional. Adam, Abraham, Moses, Joshua, David is debatable, right? But as we approach more recent past, we start getting actual historical people like Omri, Nehemiah, Ezra, Cyrus the Great, Alexander the Great, Seleucus the Great, Lucius Cornelius Scipio is in the Old Testament as well, right? And they all obviously existed. And it's even true about extra biblical Jewish literature. For example, the Essenes at Qumran wrote about how the Old Testament prophecies actually talk about Seleucid king Demetrius, for example, or Philo of Alexandria indirectly connects the Logos with Judean governor Zerubbabel, who actually really existed, right? And it then doesn't matter what kind of mythical stories are told about them. It doesn't matter, for example, whether they are the Raglan heroes or whether they are the dying and rising gods. Sure, Perseus, Bellerophon, Pelops, and Osiris are all Raglan heroes, and they didn't exist, but their moms didn't exist either, right? And they are not Raglan heroes. So really, when it comes to these figures, what accounts for them being fictional is the period in which they are depicted as living, and not whether they happen to hit any 12 of 22 specific characteristics of some mythotype that someone made up, right? So really, not taking the period of time when an ancient figure is depicted as living into consideration when we think about the prior probability of their existence is like thinking about the prior probability of someone having lung cancer, but not considering whether they are a smoker or not, right? So Jesus, pretty straightforwardly, not depicted as living in a very distant pre-archaic period. Instead, he's depicted as living in more recent history, actually pretty close to authors who wrote about him. And he's depicted as interacting with known historical figures, which again is something that the ancient authors almost never invented. So the prior probability of his existence is pretty high. Now, of course, it could be possible that Jesus is an exception, but exceptions by definition are rare, which means infrequent, which means improbable. So we would need really good evidence to overcome that low prior, which brings me to evaluation of the evidence. Now, I completely agree with a lot of mythicists that for the most part, the evidence is pretty ambiguous, and there isn't really any single bullet, silver bullet, right, that could very easily prove historicity, because if there was, mythicism probably wouldn't exist, right? So for each of the pieces of evidence, mythicists have a way of explaining it on minimal mythicism, right? And I'm sure that we are going to talk about some of the pieces of evidence later on. But for now, let me just make one really important meta point. So for each piece of the evidence, there are always at least two possible interpretations. One is a historicist, and the other one is mythicist. So these two options sort of partition the entire probability space. And usually, although not always, either interpretation could be true and historicity is still fine, but only one of them must be true and the other one must be false for mythicism to be true. I'll give you an example. The famous James, the brother of the Lord passage, right? So either Paul means biological kinship or he means fictive kinship. Obviously, we can't go back in time to ask him, so we don't know. But I, as a historicist, I'm fine with either option, because even if Paul wants to say that he met just some random Christian named James, that doesn't in any way rule out that Jesus existed. But for a myth, only one of these two options must absolutely be true, and the other one must absolutely be false. Because if Paul wants to say that he met Jesus' biological brother, well, then that rules out mythicism, right? So historicity is usually okay with the entire probability space, but mythicism is okay with only some of it, which means its probability shrinks proportionally to the portion of the probability space that must be true for mythicism to still be true, right? And the problem is that there are many, many pieces of evidence which are like that. And obviously, probabilities multiply. So to reiterate, mythicism requires much more things to be true about the world, things that we ultimately can't investigate because they happened 2000 years ago. But I don't need all of them to be true. I just need any one of them, right? And let's just say that even though we will never know for sure, I'm more confident that I happen to be right at least once than I'm confident that a mythicist is right every single time about all of the different passages, sources, interpolations, right? And to kind of close this, I have to say that when I talk to most mythicists, in the end of the day, they will say something like, you know what, I can see that there probably was just some random guy, right? Nothing crazy about that. I'm not like 100% certain about it. I can't really know either way. And if it didn't turn out to be true, I wouldn't lose any sleep about it. And I think that's really what this is about. The real God are the friends that we make along the way. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Kamil. I really appreciate that opening statement. And now John Gleason is going to, and Godless Engineer is going to go ahead and do his opening statement. So thanks a lot. If you'll mute your mic, I'll have John pop up.
All right. Well, thank you so much there, Kamil, for that opening statement. Obviously, my opening statement is not going to really refute or address hardly anything that Kamil brought up, because it's an opening statement, obviously. So this is just going to be the position that I'm coming from on the mythicism.
John, do me a favor.
topic.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Your screen and your camera's like wobbling pretty bad. I don't want everybody to start throwing up from seasick. You know what I mean?
Sorry, I'll try not to touch the table.
I apologize.
The table's a little wobbly. All right. Okay. So first I want to say thank you to Derek for thinking of me for this debate. And I thank Kamil for having the debate. I'm always very enthusiastic to talk about and discuss mythicism. Mythicism is the hypothesis that Jesus did not actually exist in history. Minimal mythicism stipulates that Jesus was originally a celestial figure that appeared to people after his death and resurrection in the lower heavens or the firmament. There is a lot of evidential support for this hypothesis. This hypothesis also seems to be the most parsimonious explanation for what we find in early Christianity. So let's start with prior to the rise of Christianity. Since Christianity originally started as a Jewish sect, it's important to understand that there were no standard set of Jewish beliefs. There was a vast landscape of different sects that existed in the first century. Their ideas about their own religion differed widely at times, and this is proven by Carrier James Charlesworth, Petra Pacomi, Eric Gruen, J. Andrew Overman, Robert McLennan, Margaret Williams, Morton Smith, Alan Siegel, and Hames Charlesworth. One of these examples would be the Essenes, as revealed by the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Essenes rejected the temple and understood the laws of Moses in completely different ways than the rest of Judaism. We also know through Philo of Alexandria that there was syncretization going on with Hellenistic ideas and the Jewish religion. In doing this, Philo's logos, an archangel figure in Jewish lore, is described exactly as the figure we would know as Jesus Christ. Philo describes this archangel as being named Jesus, the firstborn son of God, God's agent of creation, his celestial high priest, and who is involved with cleansing the world of sin. Philo of Alexandria, using Zechariah 6:11 through 13 for this archangel logos figure, shows that there were groups of Jews that were searching the scriptures for indications of who and what this Messiah Redeemer figure was supposed to be. We also have pre-Christian Jewish traditions of the scriptures contained in the Talmud. These traditions would include an interpretation of Isaiah 53 as speaking about the Messiah, a dying and rising Christ, son of Joseph, quoting Zechariah 12:10, and this Christ figure would be pierced to death. While the Talmud dates between the 4th and 6th century CE, the Jews definitely wouldn't have invented a Christ with a father named Joseph who dies and is resurrected to be man's redeemer of sins after Christianity arose. This would only validate what the Christians were already espousing. If it did arise after Christianity arose, we should expect some argument against what the Christians were claiming, but we don't find that. So at this point, we have some Jews in the Jewish community that were obviously expecting a suffering, disgraced, and dying Christ figure named Jesus who would resurrect from the dead and absolve mankind of all their sin. This is the great Redeemer described throughout the Jewish scriptures. The book of Daniel actually lays out a timeline that would eventually culminate in the early 30s AD with the coming of the same Messiah figure. Now we cue Paul and his Christ figure. Paul was a diaspora Jew who was writing in the 50s CE and merging his Jewish ideas with pagan philosophy, literature, and mystery cults. Exactly as Philo had done. Paul, as well as Philo, wrote in Greek, which was only taught in pagan schools and thus would make it highly unlikely that Paul and his theology wouldn't be influenced by pagan traditions. Paul's Christ figure was only ever experienced through visions or hallucinations and by reading the scriptures, namely Galatians 1:11 through 16, Romans 10:14 through 17, 1 Corinthians 9:1, 1 Corinthians 15:3 through 15:3 through 15, Romans 16:25 and 26. The same scriptures that we just discussed as describing Jesus Christ that Paul knows. Apparently I didn't finish that sentence. The same scriptures that we just discussed as describing this Jesus Christ that Paul knows ends up being the exact description that Philo gives of his Jesus archangel. They were both the firstborn son of God, Romans 8:29, the image of God, 2 Corinthians 4:4, God's agent of creation, 1 Corinthians 10:1 through 4, and a pre-existent being, I think that's Philemon 2:6 through 8, 1 Corinthians 10:1 through 4. Now, Hebrews, while not written by Paul, but at the generally same time as Paul was writing, describes Jesus as God's high priest and the supreme angel of all the angels. That would be Hebrews 1 and 8. It's incredibly impossible that Paul and Philo would have independently come up with the exact same Christ figure. We see both sets of these ideas, Philo's and Paul's, culminating together after the 1st century with Justin Martyr in his first apology. He ends up calling Jesus both the Logos and the firstborn Son of God. Now, if it's true that there was a diverse set of Jewish beliefs in the 1st century and more than one group had ideas about this Savior figure, then we should expect to find multiple different messiahs arising around the same time. We find exactly that. These Savior figures went by many names, including Messiah, Son of Man, the Righteous One, the Elect, or Chosen One. The Jews, including Paul and Philo, were reading the scriptures and pulling out different ideas about this Messiah figure. One of these Messiah interpretations was a conquering military Messiah. We know this because of Josephus describing the Egyptian Messiah who approached Jerusalem with his army from the Mount of Olives, which is how scripture foretells it. But he was defeated. it is very plausible that the failure of a historically existing Messiah delivering the Jews to a supposed military victory, that failure swayed some of the Jews to a more spiritual, celestial Messiah interpretations that had already won this eternal victory and provided salvation. The death and resurrection that Paul had experienced was told by Jesus through his hallucinations or visions most probably happened in the firmament or the lower heavens. The Ascension of Isaiah is a first century Christian work that explicitly states that this is what happened. The Ascension was later redacted to include a pocket gospel that places events on earth. However, the earliest redaction of this document does not include this portion. Jesus' death and resurrection in the celestial realm of the firmament would also match what was being taught in other pagan religions of the time, like the Isis and Osiris cults. If Jesus had really existed, why would they have needed to further information about him? Why couldn't they just refer to what Jesus actually said or did? Why did they have to use scripture to infer information about him? Why is it so important that to Paul that he clearly separate himself from any historical source? He could have referenced the disciples at some point, but he never indicates anyone as being a disciple of Jesus, only an apostle. Apostles were those that had a vision of this Messiah figure and had been revealed the quote-unquote truth through the scriptures. So this covers basically my thought process on why Jesus probably didn't exist. I'm not saying that I'm 100% certain or anything like that. I'm just saying that with all of the background information about what the Jewish Christian landscape looked like in the first century, it's very plausible that they inferred all of the information that we now know about Jesus from the scriptures. And I feel like I have connected that idea with reality by the fact that Philo of Alexandria clearly lays out his Logos figure and describes him exactly like Paul ends up describing Jesus Christ. And in the Talmud, actually, there is this Messiah figure that is read from the Isaiah 53 passage. And with the fact that this is most likely a pre-Christian tradition in Judaism, it only helps to solidify my position more that the Jewish people were expecting a suffering and dying, disgraced Messiah figure to resurrect and absolve humankind of their sins. And this eventually propagated to the point where earthly tales were told of him through euhemerization, where these tales were constructed as if to give some credence to the religion. Of course, this happened at a time when any possible eyewitnesses would have been dying off. There was also somewhat of a dark age happening at that point. So we don't really have a lot of information about the differing sects, but we do get glimpses into the fact that those sects that claimed that Jesus was a celestial figure were indeed there. Like 2 Peter. 2 Peter says that the Christians didn't believe in cleverly devised myths about Jesus, but that they actually experienced him. The only reason why they would have to fabricate an experience with a historically existing Jesus is if they didn't have any real historical information about this Jesus person, and he was just a celestial figure. So this all culminates with the fact that Paul, our earliest person to even write about Jesus, never references any kind of historical information about Jesus, but only conveys information that he received through visions and read in scriptures, which is completely parsimonious with what we understand about Jews in the first century reading the scriptures in order to get information about this Messiah figure. So I don't know how under time I am, but I do believe that's all that I have.
That's perfectly fine. We had a minute left. Thank you both, gentlemen, for the opening statement. That went really well. I really appreciate it. You guys who've been listening to MythVision for a long time and all the scholars, I think you can wrap your head around the differences here, but I want to allow for you guys to have like a cross-examination discussion. This isn't going to be formal. It's not going to be organized where, Kamil, you must do this. And then, I want you guys to have an open discussion back and forth. Fair warning, John is on vacation. So he's dealing, he usually has his hookup, his setup, but I really do appreciate that. I wanted to say both of your opening statements were really well on defining both sides of the story. And we will get to Q&A in just a bit, ladies and gentlemen. So get your questions ready. You want to super chat them and let me see them? Definitely do that. If not, at me, at MythVision, but save them for later because I can't scroll up after a certain while. It gets too congested. So with that being said, whoever wants to cross-examine whoever first and just start the conversation back and forth. If I have to jump in, I will, but I'm going to back out to allow you guys both to have the screen. You guys are muted, I think. Both of you.
We're both muted.
No, I just wanted to say go first because I started with the opening. By the way, I agreed with like 99% of what you said, so I don't know what we are going to be talking about.
Well, I mean, I feel like there's obviously points of contention. I don't know. We could start with what you think is the best evidence to suggest that Jesus did exist in history. Maybe not necessarily cover what we covered in our opening statements, which I do have some notes on your opening statement. But if you I don't know if you maybe wanted to start. If you don't have anything to start with me, I could. I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good question, right? So as I mentioned, I don't think there is like a super silver bullet. So there isn't anything that cuts like directly one way where you can just pull the passage and there you go, right? This is what sometimes people imagine. They imagine that like mythicists have never heard about Josephus or something like that, right? The brother of the Lord. So that's obviously not true, right? But seems to me pretty obvious that like in order to account for like all of these bits and pieces here and there, like mythicism, it's no longer like minimal mythicism. It becomes this super elaborate Rube Goldberg machine where like all the knobs must be tweaked in just one like super specific way, and if only one of the knobs happen to tweak differently, then the whole thing falls apart, right?
Well,
there are a number of passages in Paul where, it's pretty ambiguous usually, right? But again, like I only need to be right once, and you have to be basically right with your explanation every single time, because if Paul just happens to mention Jesus once and clearly like places him on earth, then there goes mythicism. Or actually, maybe would be... Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I was just going to point out all you're doing is describing how mythicism is falsifiable. And the only thing that I can think of is that that's the mark of a good hypothesis. I mean, if it is falsifiable, then it is a good hypothesis, because you literally only have to pull out like one piece of evidence that definitely refutes mythicism and you've destroyed it. So if mythicism is false, then you should be able to give me that one piece of evidence that ultimately disregards it.
Yeah, that's I've noticed that this is like very often how people approach it. They think that, okay, if there isn't any like single piece of evidence that clearly proves the case, then am I able to come up with an explanation for all of the pieces of evidence that is consistent with mythicism? Yes. No, therefore, it's reasonable for me to believe to be a mythicist, right? But that's
I'm so sorry, Kamil. Kamil, I could have sworn, maybe I just misunderstood, but I could have sworn you just went through an entire explanation of how you only need to be right once. Are you now claiming that it's somehow bad that you only need to be right once?
No, I think that's actually great, right? No, I'm just describing the thought process, right? Like, so it seems to me to be the case that like mythicists usually approach it this way. Is there any like silver bullet that would clearly show very easily that Jesus existed? No. Am I able to come up with an explanation of all of the different pieces of evidence in question that's consistent with mythicism? Yes. Therefore, it's reasonable to be a mythicist, right? But what I'm saying is that, like, if we think about it in terms of betting odds, right? Like, if I roll a large number of dice at the same time, it's better for me to bet that, let's say, number 4 is going to come up at least once, then it's better for me to bet that it's never going to come up, right? Even though it's just one number out of 6. And that's what I'm saying, right? So for mythicism to be true, you would have to be correct about every single thing that I throw at you. But the point is that more often than not, I can clearly accept even the mythicist interpretation of the evidence, and I'm still fine. It's not going to undercut the idea that Jesus existed, right?
How does that differ from any other historical person or event? Really?
In what way?
Well, I mean, like, for instance, Caesar crossing the Rubicon. In order for us to know that that actually happened, every single piece of evidence that it did happen has to be correct. I'm not really, I guess I'm just not exactly seeing the difference between the mythicist hypothesis and like any other hypothesis about any other person or event in history.
Yeah, sure. That's actually a great example, right? So obviously the methodology is the same every single time, right? So there are two components, the prior probability and the expectedness of the evidence. And for something like Caesar crossing the Rubicon, the prior probability is high, right? Like a general marching from the Gauls to Italy pretty much would have to go through the river Rubicon, right? And then the expectedness of the evidence is like massively in favor of that actually happening, right? Because it has to do with like the nature of the sources and what followed from that particular move and stuff like that, right? Like if Caesar didn't cross the Rubicon, but instead went to, I don't know, Britain instead, it would be very difficult to explain how, all of the subsequent events unfolded if he wasn't in Rome and like interact with other figures and stuff like that. So it's exactly the same, And as I mentioned, like even if all of the pieces of evidence are on balance pretty ambiguous, where, like either mythicism, like it's consistent with mythicism and it's also consistent with minimal historicity, then there you have the high prior probability, right? So it's reasonable to believe there probably was just some guy named Jesus, just in virtue of it being pretty intrinsically probable, and the fact that he was mythicized later doesn't really change that.
So as far as like Christianity goes, it's not just there was some Messiah or not Messiah, but some guy named Jesus that claimed to be the Messiah. It's a very specific, it's somewhat of a specific definition of a guy, because obviously there were Jesuses at the time. I mean, regularly the Talmud is brought out as proving that Jesus existed in history, because in the Talmud they have the one Jesus that was killed, but he was killed under King Jannaeus, which is 100 years prior to Christianity. And
yeah, that's actually not what it says. It's true.
No, that's exactly what it says, and that is that is the majority scholarship on the Jesus in the Talmud.
There is a passage which places Jesus during the reign of Alexander Janus, but he doesn't die in that passage. There's a different passage in the Talmud where Jesus
which
dies.
Is the same Jesus.
Sure, but like that specific passage, right? So there are at least two passages, right? One describes when Jesus died, and the other one describes when he supposedly lived. And yeah, I absolutely agree. I actually have like a really awesome quote about the Talmud, right? It's from Jacob Neusner, Talmud as a historical source, right? So far as history claims exactly to spell out events that happened at a particular time and place, the Talmud and the rest of the rabbinic tradition are of late antiquity do not serve. They do not supply reliable historical information about once upon a time. Rabbinic documentation contains stories about things that allegedly took place, which we cannot validate or invalidate. The record statements in the name of biblical and rabbinic authorities, which we have no means of investigating, verifying or falsifying. They describe a social order, evidence of which we cannot locate in the material records. The institutions the record or impact of which we cannot recover. The stories the rabbinical canon preserved were not told by contemporaries, eyewitnesses to what is told. Stenographers did not bear witness to what was said, and the chain of tradition of those stories generally commences with the earliest documentary testimony, long after the events were portrayed. And the manuscript evidence of the documentation hardly wins any confidence, right? So pretty damning, right, for the Talmud. But historians still think that the various rabbis mentioned in the Talmud actually existed. They just don't think we get very much reliable information about what they did and said, which is definitely true about Jesus as well, right? So sure, in the Talmud, in one passage, Jesus is depicted as being a disciple of one very famous rabbi who gets into conflict, and Jesus is basically humiliated. But I think that expectedness of us having that, even if Jesus actually existed in the first century, is about as high as expectedness of us having it on Mythicism, because Talmud is just all over the place, and clearly the people who put the tradition together had no interest about preserving historical veracity, right? Like,
so hold on.
Yeah.
So sorry. My point was that generally that is given by historicists as a piece of evidence that shows that Jesus existed in history.
Yeah, if someone tries to argue that Jesus existed because he's depicted in the Talmud, you should slap him in the face.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm gonna assault him, but that was just all my point was that some people point to that.
You're not debating Jonathan McLavchie. I'm sorry. You'll have to do better.
Yeah. Still, I get that in your perspective, it's much more likely that a Jesus existed than not. But what I'm specifically asking you is that, what evidence sways you, I guess, toward, like, as you said in your opening, on your worst days, you're more like 90% certain. On those worst days, what are the most convincing pieces of evidence to you? Not just the speculative, he had to have existed.
Sure. No, I see what you're trying to get at. No, yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's get serious, right? So, okay, let's just pick one, right? And by the way, for the audience, notice so that we are going to have two interpretations. One is going to be historicist, and the other one is going to be mythicist. Now, I am actually fine with both, but I think John is not going to be. He will only have to stick with one, because the other one would actually rule out mythicism, right? Well, we can go, for example, to 1 Thessalonians 2, 14 to 16. I actually am convinced that there's a partial interpolation. So I think what's authentic is this: for you, brothers and sisters, became imitators of the churches of God in Jesus Christ that are in Judea. For you suffered the same things from your own companions as they did from the Jews, who killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out. And then what's interpolated is they displeased God and opposed everyone by hindering us from speaking to the Gentiles so that they may be saved. And then the rest of verse 16, right? I think there are basically two alternatives. There is the hypothesis of partial interpolation and full interpolation. Obviously, full interpolation needs much more text to be interpolated, so it's intrinsically much less probable. I actually need only about half of the text to be interpolated, so the prior probability of my hypothesis is about 2 times higher. And then there are roughly 5 major arguments for the idea that the passage was interpolated. 3 of those arguments I'm completely covered, because they talk about the same passage that I also think is interpolated. And the other 2 arguments are in favor of the passage that I think is authentic being interpolated. And I think in that case, those 2 arguments cumulatively don't nearly point towards the entire passage being interpolated enough to overtake that prior, essentially. So yeah, in which case Paul mentions Jesus being killed by the Jews, so that's case closed, right? But we obviously don't know how the text looked like 2,000 years ago. We can't travel back in time, right? So this isn't like a silver bullet. But this is what sometimes gets me like on Wednesdays to 90%.
So, Kamil, how do you explain the very un-Pauline nature of that particular? Because I don't know if I just didn't hear, but you're talking about 1 Thessalonians, right?
Yeah, sorry, First Thessalonians 2:14.
First Thessalonians.
Yeah, First Thessalonians.
There's a lot of un-Pauline things about that particular passage. So, I mean, I'm just kind of curious how do you fit that into the idea that it's not fully like at least the part, because you do accept the one part being interpolated, but the other part about the Jews killing Jesus, that part being interpolated, because that seems to be a very un-Pauline thing for him to say.
What is? Sorry.
Well, Paul blaming the Jews for killing Jesus.
Well, he doesn't blame them. He just says they killed him, right? So on Historicity, he's just reporting what happened. I definitely agree.
Well, yeah, but that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
sorry.
I definitely agree that the anti-Semitic language is very unlike Paul. That's what I think. It was interpolated, right? Like
no, it's not just that it's unlike Paul, though. There, Kamil, because this is only ever found in this one particular part of Paul, ever in all of Paul's work. Earlier in your introduction, you talked about there being exceptions and how they're improbable. Wouldn't that make this particular section highly improbable that he would have written it?
Yeah, I think I have a problem with that methodology. It's essentially saying Paul can't be talking about historical Jesus here because he isn't talking about historical Jesus elsewhere, right? But like you can apply it
I'm not
every single time,
I'm not talking.
Yeah.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the anti-Semitic language. Like the entire content of that of the sections that are said to be interpolated, which there's massive support for this in the scholarly community, by the way. Just for anybody that's watching, there's a lot of support for interpolation of this entire part. But just the anti-Semitic language that is used there, because I mean, why on earth would he be anti-Semitic at that point? Because at this point, Paul is a Jewish Christian, right? He was a Jew, and then he became Christian, thus making him a Jewish Christian.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, definitely the anti-Semitic part Paul never said, right? He clearly think that Jews were saved or are able to be saved, right? So he didn't think that they are going to be damned. And actually, I think that one of the very good pieces of evidence for thinking that the passage was interpolated is it seems to be suggesting that the temple was already destroyed, right? Because it says, but God's wrath has overtaken them at last. So what could that mean? Well, probably the destruction of the temple, right? But we can establish that Paul wrote before then, right? Very probably. Even though I don't support the tradition about when and where Paul died. I think that's pretty historically unreliable. So I can imagine that Paul probably survived the destruction of the temple. But yeah, the anti-Semitic stuff is totally out. But the partial interpolation doesn't have that anti-Semitic stuff, right? What Paul is talking about says he's actually talking to Thessalonians, and he wants to say, look, you have to start imitating the churches in Judea. Why? They are good moral exemplar. And why they are moral exemplar? Well, because they happened to be, just now, as I'm writing, persecuted by the Jews. And they are handling it very well. So you should be like them. So on the historical hypothesis, well, that's what was going on, right? So Paul mentioned, they are being oppressed essentially by the Jews who killed Jesus and the prophets and throw us out, right? So I don't see how this is unexpected on historicity.
Well, it would be unexpected because it's very antithetical to everything that Paul taught about the Jews being saved by God. I mean, in Romans 3, in Romans 9 and 10 and Romans 15, Paul talks about the Gentile Christian. Paul is trying to dissuade Gentile Christians from their hostility towards Jews and explain God's plan for them. And then at other points, Paul even talks about how God forgave the Jews even after killing former prophets. So I guess I just don't understand why this one particular shift in placing this blame on them as far as like killing Jesus.
Well,
and
because
whatnot.
that's what actually happened, right? Like again, in verse 16, sorry, I think when supposedly Paul says, "Thus they have constantly been filling up the measure of their sins." Well, that's something that Paul would never write, right? That's clearly anti-Semitic, and that's clearly contrary to his view on Jews, right? But him saying, "Look, to the Thessalonians, start imitating the churches of God who are being persecuted by the Jews, who, as you all know, also killed Jesus." I don't see any reason why Paul couldn't have wrote that. And I will even give you that. I can give you that, on balance, that part being authentic is at least somewhat unexpected on Historicity, but I don't think that's enough. It points to I don't think it points to it being interpolated as well, nearly enough to overcome the fairly low prior of any given passage in the Pauline letters being interpolations, right?
If I could have John respond to that quickly,
you might have some. Yeah,
I was going to say have John respond to that.
There.
Let's move to a push it forward into a new section. Let's say you give it to him, Kamil, and let's see what else happens into further, because we don't want to run out of time only on 1 Thessalonians.
Yeah, that's a good point. So let me maybe ask a question. So if Paul mentioned Pilate, would that disprove mythicism?
I mean, I think that it definitely would sway in the favor of historicity. But I really think that it kind of depends on the context, because it's pretty obvious, through Josephus, that Pilate was very prominent to the Jewish people, being that he was a ruler in that region. So, I mean, I think it would depend on the context.
Yeah. So if Paul mentioned Jesus being crucified by Pilate, would that disprove mythicism?
Yeah, I kind of think that really kind of goes against your whole argument for 1 Thessalonians, not to drudge that back up, but it kind of seems disjointed with the 1 Thessalonians argument that you have. But I think that if you had a verse, an authentic verse written by Paul, where Paul says Pilate crucified Jesus, I would think that would weigh heavily against mythicism.
Do you think that would make mythicism more probably false than true?
I mean, I'm not really sure. Again, I hate playing the speculation game, because we don't have a verse from Paul where it's
I'm just asking, what would falsify mythicism? So would that falsify mythicism?
Oh, well, I mean, Paul, for one thing, Paul being the first one and really the only independent one to write about Jesus, if he had mentioned something to connect him to an earthly existence, I would say that would weigh heavily against mythicism, depending on the context of it.
Sure. And do you think, if he said, for example, in the first chapter of Romans, as you all know, Jesus Christ, who was crucified in Judea under Pontius Pilate, would that, if we actually had that in the manuscript, would that mean that, now mythicism is more probably false than true?
I mean, yeah, again, depending on the context, because, there's a lot of interpolations that have happened in the Bible, as we had just discussed one. I think depending on the context of it, I think that it definitely could be the falsifying attribute, something that actually links Jesus to a historical existence here on earth from Paul would be really good evidence against mythicism.
If we could somehow rule out interpolation, I don't know how we would do it, but let's say that we have
that's what I'm saying. An authentic reference from Paul somehow placing Jesus here on earth, I think would be a really good piece of evidence that would make him historical. But I'm kind of curious, because I felt like in your opening statement, you presented an unfalsifiable narrative for historicity. So, I mean, what is your falsifiability criteria?
Well, I mean, you would just have to get the prior probability low enough, right? And there you go, easy peasy.
No.
I
I
should
mean, see,
actually, I would before you.
I got a
before
problem
you
with
go,
that though,
yeah,
Camel.
sorry. Before you do, before you go on, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question because I don't really understand why Paul mentioning Pilate would disprove mythicism, right? Because you have to like remember that under minimal mythicism, there is the idea that there were essentially two levels of initiation in the mystery religion that was Christianity, right? So the people who were in kind of in the first circle, they were told the allegorized version of the story, where Jesus actually walks around on earth and like interacts with historical people, right? Like, that's why the Gospels were written. Like the Gospel authors on mythicism didn't actually believe in the historical Jesus, right? They just created this like allegorical version. But then if you became initiated and you actually became like a part of the core, like the inner circle in the cult, then you were actually revealed this like cosmic truth that no, actually Jesus didn't die on earth. He died like in lower heavens, right? Or under the firmament. So yeah, I think even if we found a letter of Paul where he talks about Joseph, Mary, Pilate, I don't think that would disprove mythicism because you could always say, well, Paul is just writing to the uninitiated Christians. So of course he can't just spill the cosmic truth, right? But then it makes me wonder, like, what falsifies mythicism though, right? Like, for example, can you give me?
Hold on. Can we handle that real quick? So why do you think that apostles, which you understand that I'm assuming that you understand that apostles would be those that personally received visions of Jesus, right?
Well, that's what Paul says. I don't know what like Cephas would say or Peter.
Okay, well, I mean, as far as we can know from the actual information that we have, that's what an apostle is.
Yeah, I think Paul is saying that. I think Paul is saying that for like a clear, like very obvious reason, right? Because he wasn't actually a disciple of Jesus. So of course he's going to say, well, the reason, like the way how you became an apostle is not by following Jesus when he was alive. Because if he said that, that would immediately take away his authority, right? Like he needs to say, what makes someone an apostle is receiving revelations from Jesus, because anyone can claim that, including
But I mean,
him.
Paul never at all indicates that you didn't have to, walk with Jesus. Like he never talks about anybody either not walking with Jesus or walking with Jesus.
Exactly, because if he did, he would just massively shoot himself on the foot, right? He doesn't want his audience to think about there being disciples who actually knew Jesus on earth, because if his audience members realized that, they would start wondering what those disciples say about what Jesus said when he was on earth, right? And they would realize that Paul is actually feeding them his own theological innovation. Like Paul wants you to think about Jesus as this like being that communicates from heaven through revelations, because he didn't have any actual like discipleship, right? He can't point to that. He has to point to revelation.
I'm sorry, I got to push back against this, because the only message that mattered to the apostles in general was the message that Paul received through visions of Jesus Christ. So
well,
I mean,
Paul says.
That's
what Paul says. Like you would absolutely expect in him to do exactly what he does on Historicity, right? He wasn't a disciple, so of course he wants to. Sorry?
See, Kamil, this is what I'm talking about. You're presenting an unfalsifiable narrative on your end. Everything that we actually have information for seems to be expected on Historicity. That makes your hypothesis unfalsifiable. And to push back against you saying that, Paul mentioning Pilate, it would not disprove mythicism. I specified the context in which it was being mentioned in would definitely factor into it. But you're assuming that Paul, the one who's an apostle who was accepted amongst the other apostles, at least as far as we can tell, was somehow not initiated into the highest rings of the religion at the time. I find that to be very improbable.
I'm not necessarily saying that he wasn't initiated, right? I'm just saying that first of all, he wouldn't reveal the cosmic truth in his letters, right? And second of all, of course, it's in his best interest to depict apostleship as being directly linked to revelation, and it's in his best interest never to talk about what Jesus actually did and said on earth, and about people who actually were his disciples, right? He never says, by the way, Cephas was Jesus's earthly disciple, right? Because then he would be drawing the attention of his audience towards the fact that his own version of the gospel is actually his own theological innovation, and it's not based in. Sorry,
but it wasn't.
Sure, it was. Like that's the whole.
In Galatians, hold on. In Galatians 2, he goes and he confers with the other apostles, and he finds that his gospel, his message that he's teaching, is no different than the ones that they're teaching. So how can it be his personal theology that he's teaching, but his personal theology is also the theology of all of the other apostles?
Okay, where did Paul get the idea that you don't have to follow the Torah in order to be a Christian? Did he get it from other men, or did he get it, as he would say, from the revelation?
I mean, I'm not exactly sure on that point, but I mean, I would think that any information that he claimed to be from Jesus, he would have only gotten it from a vision of Jesus.
Well, there you go. So it came from his head eventually, right?
Well, so there you go. It did. Hold on. I mean, it did, but again, in Galatians 2, this is the only historical account that we have of anything happening around the 50s AD. In Galatians 2, he met with other apostles. He confirmed the message that he was teaching, which would have been the entire message that he was teaching, was the same that the other apostles are also teaching.
Yeah, well, I think what actually happened is that they achieved some kind of political consensus and Paul basically says this explicitly. They essentially split the Christendom, right? And Peter was the apostle for the circumcised. So Peter, and by extension the Jerusalem church, would proselytize to the Jews, and they would still follow the Jewish law, right? But what was confirmed is that it's okay for Paul to keep going around converting Gentiles, and they don't have to follow the law. Like, this is what was agreed. And interestingly enough, apparently this agreement didn't really work. Like, not everyone was on board with it, because first you have the rebuke of Cephas in Antioch, right, in Galatians 1:6-8. But then also that, like, the entire reason why the letter to the Galatians was written is because Paul is angry at Galatians, because they were actually listening to someone else who came to them, someone who preached a different gospel than Paul, and they actually listened to them, right? So, and he's chastising them very clearly and very strongly. And then the rest of the letter is essentially explaining exactly the parts that he innovated to nail home, to drive home the points that were in this disagreement, right? And also, I think a conflict between Pauline and Petrine Christianity continuing to be a serious problem is also the reason why the books of Acts was written, because Acts is essentially revisionist historical fiction, and it specifically diverts from what is reporting in the Pauline epistles in order to make sure that the reader gets the picture that Peter and Paul were on the same page, from day one, that there never was any theological disagreement between them, which of course indicates that there was, right? That's why they had to cover it up. So there you go, right? And there is, of course, an interesting hypothesis, but that's not very strongly supported, that actually the Gospel of Mark is a product of the Pauline faction, and it's specifically a hit piece against the Petrine faction. So by that logic, the conflict still continued even in the 70s. That's, for example, explains very nicely why the Jerusalem pillars, Peter, James, and John, are depicted as being so dumb in the Gospels. They don't get it because they didn't have the proper theology. Paul had, right?
Well, okay, but if we can get back to how, what's your falsifiability criteria for historicity?
Yeah, so just get the prior probability of Jesus' existence high enough, and
Well,
then
no,
there you go.
but you see, that's really putting it in ambiguous terms for people. Also, I mean, I know that you know the math well enough on Bayesian reasoning to know that, obviously people can misuse the method in order to make it say. I mean, it's pretty commonly known that probability, you can get it to say whatever you want it to say, right? As long as you represent the math in a certain way, you can get it to say anything you want to. So my point, what I'm saying is like my falsifiability criteria is that, Paul or some just an independent source that is historically sourced mentioning something that would tie Jesus to an earthly existence would disprove mythicism as a hypothesis.
Why
That's
though?
my
Like
huh?
I think that you could still make it consistent with mythicism, no problem, right? Just say they are retelling the
Why?
allegorical
So,
earthly version.
Kamil, I'm so sorry to stop you in the middle of this. Why are you taking what I'm saying and then telling me I'm wrong about what I'm saying, and that what you are saying is actually correct about my own position?
Because I know mythicism better than you, maybe. I don't know. Like, just to think about it, right?
Can we
Like,
calm down with the condescension, please?
sorry, Karen. No, seriously though. Like, what I'm pointing out is that for the particular pieces of evidence that you mentioned, the internal structure of mythicism is such that they are still explicable on mythicism, right? Like, even if we had an authentic passage in Paul mentioning Jesus being crucified under Pilate, you can still very easily explain it with mythicism, right? Just maybe to illustrate the point, right? Who do you think was the earliest Christian that we know of who actually believed in a historical Jesus? So he bought into the Gospels. And why do you think that?
Well, I mean, it would have to be. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, we're just. I mean, this is all like getting on to speculation. You're asking
Do you
me
think
to
Polycarp
speculate who the
believed? Do you
first
think
one was.
Polycarp
I
believed
could
in
say,
a historical Jesus?
well, I could say any number of the church fathers that actually believe that Jesus was a historical figure. The fact is that at that point, being in the 2nd century, I mean, it wouldn't be any issue for Christians to believe that Jesus was a historical figure. I don't understand the point of this questioning right now.
Well, so here's the point, right? So, for example, was Polycarp a historicist, right? Well, he quotes the Gospels, he talks about Jesus on earth, right? So does that like establish that he was a historicist? Well, no, because you can always say he's just talking about the allegorical version of the myth, right? Ignatius, the same. Papias, the same. Justin Martyr, right? So it seems to me that every time there is something in the Christian literature that seems to point in the direction of there being historical Jesus, you can just say this is the allegorical version of the real cosmic truth. And every time you find something that seems to indicate that Christians, at least some, originally believed that Jesus didn't exist. That's great evidence for mythicism, right? Like Justin Martyr in the Dialogue of Trypho supposedly alludes to mythicism. So that counts as evidence for mythicism, apparently, right? But him, I think, obviously thinking that Jesus actually existed, can still, under mythicism, be explained as him just alluding to the cosmic version of the myth. Like you can always play that card, right?
Yeah, well, see, here's how I feel like your argument pretty much culminates to is that I'm sitting here saying that mythicism is falsifiable, and then you're rewriting what I'm saying into something that makes it unfalsifiable, while you yourself refuse to give any kind of real falsifiability criteria.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Cool. So, what would specifically make me believe that it's more likely that Jesus didn't exist than that he did is if we actually look through the primary sources and we found out that it was like super common for ancient authors to invent fictional characters who have like all kinds of crazy supernatural powers, like they were incarnations of gods, they were conceived by gods, they work miracles, they are raised from the dead, whatever, right? And they actually place them in like, a generation ago, basically in their own time, and then have them interact with, governors and high priests who we can establish independently actually existed. Like if it was really common, if, for example, if the situation in the ancient literature was comparable, I just want to say, like, really quickly. So if the situation in the ancient literature, when it comes to this kind of pattern of like literary development, was comparable to, for example, superheroes today, then I would say Jesus is probably just another invented figure, right? Like 2000 years from now, when historians dig up Superman, and they will already know that Spider-Man didn't exist, and Batman didn't exist, and Wonder Woman didn't exist, they will have no reason to think that there actually was Clark Kent, right? But actually, in the ancient sources, it's exactly the opposite.
Okay, listen. All right. So I want you to put yourself in the shoes of Paul, right? Mm-hmm. Put yourself in the shoes of Paul. Got it. But first you'll have to so sorry. My Android wants to answer my question before I can ask it. Put yourself in the position of Paul and ask yourself, who did Paul claim Jesus interacted with on earth, like in an earthly way? Can you name one single person that Paul says Jesus interacted with?
Well, I mean, he probably interacted with his brothers, right?
Well, no. See, I specifically asked you to name one person that Paul indicates as Jesus interacting with him.
That's a really good question. I don't think there is any passage like that.
Right. There's not. Because for Paul, in all of his writings that you can look at, he only ever indicates Jesus as being this celestial figure, which, mind you, was a physical place. The celestial realm was, I think that we agree on that the celestial realm was a physical place. And we have first century documentation of Christians believing that Jesus descended through all the different layers of heaven, shedding his godlike abilities and powers, and becoming this physical person in the celestial realm, being crucified by Satan and his demons in the firmament, and then resurrecting back up to the higher levels of heaven. I mean, the ascension of Isaiah is the one that I'm referencing here, which I'm sure that you've got something to explain away about that. But the fact is that there were first century records of this exact thing being taught by Christians, or at least maybe not being taught, but being believed by a group of Christians. So, I mean, I don't know. I'm incredibly frustrated at the fact that I'm sitting here telling you how you can falsify mythicism, but then you just tell me that I'm wrong about mythicism in general. And
I tell it how I see it, right? I don't know. Shall we move on?
Yeah, I guess we'll have to.
Can you maybe name an ancient fictional character invented to be a culmination of Old Testament prophecies other than Jesus?
So you're wanting me to describe another person that is Jesus?
No, I'm specifically asking, is there any other example of someone who was invented as a culmination of Old Testament prophecies who didn't actually exist, and who is depicted as interacting a generation before the authors lived?
I mean, I can't give you a very
this is a
very specific request right here that I don't think that we really need to have in order.
Let's make it more general. Is there any dying and rising God who is depicted as living a generation before, when the sources mention him?
That's still kind of specific there. I mean, you understand that the minimum mythicist hypothesis says that the Christian religion was syncretized with surrounding pagan religions, which would have been, like the Isis and Osiris cult, being that eventually, as far as the state of the cult in the first century, it came to be known that to the public and to the lower ranks of the cult, historical stories were told about Isis and Osiris, but at the higher ranks of the cult, it was just known that all of these things were of celestial figures. And this is the exact progression that we see in Christianity, because like with Paul, being that he's an apostle, he's in the highest ranks of the religion at the time, he only espouses a celestial figure of Christ. And so regardless of what they taught to the newer Christians that were coming into the faith, it was still celestial version of Christ at the heart of the cult, which is the same thing as the Isis and Osiris cult, which the Isis and Osiris cult is a dying and rising God cult.
Okay, and is there any... when was Osiris depicted as living on Earth?
I mean, I didn't prepare for
I think it's more than 10,000.
Isis and Osiris.
I think it's more than.
And I really think that it's immaterial to the point being made here.
Yeah, that's like saying it's immaterial whether you smoke or not when we are talking about lung cancer.
I don't really think so, there, Kamil.
Like the numbers, the frequencies of people speaks for themselves, right? Can you give me an example of a rank Raglan hero who have stories about him set in like a generation ago, like let's say within 100 years? Sorry?
How does that matter?
That's what I'm saying, right?
No, it doesn't matter like how long ago they were set or anything like that. It literally doesn't matter.
Sure it does. Like if it didn't matter, then what we should observe would be like a roughly equal distribution of both fictional and historical characters, regardless of when they are depicted as living, right? But apparently, when ancient characters who have supernatural powers, who ascend to heaven, who are worshipped as God, when they are depicted as living, is extremely important, because all of the fictional people are depicted as living in a distant pre-archaic mythical age, right? And that's not just dying and rising God and Raglan heroes. It's exactly everyone. Heracles is a dying and rising god. He's a Raglan hero, I think. He lived in a very distant pre-archaic past, right? But so did his brother, Iphicles, who wasn't a Raglan hero. So this is actually massively important for establishing the prior probability, right? And I explained why. There was a very strong literary convention which basically said that ancient authors were just not in a habit of inventing the kind of people that Jesus supposedly is on Mythicism, right? That's why there are no other figures like him. That's why, all of the examples like Heracles, Romulus, Asclepius, Osiris, all of them are depicted as living like thousands of years ago in like a distant past, right? And there isn't the Gospel of Heracles who would depict him as, he was born in Italy in like 60 BCE, doesn't exist. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about.
Hold on. So I mean, I feel like you're kind of mixing up a lot of things here, because I feel like you're kind of dipping your toes into like the Gospels and what information they relay, which is as far as we can tell, nearly all fictional. So I feel like you're dipping into the Gospels and mixing it up with Paul and his figure, because Paul's figure of Jesus actually pre-existed the existence of the universe. So if you're looking for a celestial figure that was dated way back into the past, I think pre-existing the universe being created is pretty far back into the past. Now, if you want to go to the Gospels, I think that we can both agree that none of them are really indicative of something that happened here on Earth, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe you think that some of the things captured in it, actually existed or happened.
Yeah, so there's going to be the same dynamic as there is with the Pauline epistles, right? So if we take out all of the like supernatural stuff, then we have all kinds of mundane claims, right? Jesus came from Nazareth. He proclaimed the coming kingdom of God. He was believed to be the Messiah. He criticized the Pharisees. He was an exorcist. He intentionally associated with people who were considered unclean. He was baptized by John the Baptist. He came to Jerusalem during the Passover. He broke bread at night, with disciples the night before he was handed over. He was betrayed by Judas. He was tried by the Sanhedrin Council, handed over to Pilate, crucified by the Romans. And then, of course, everything that Jesus said, like all of the sayings, right? And what I'm saying is that for historicity to be true, only one of those things actually needs to trace to a historical Jesus. But for mythicism to be true, all of that must be fictional, 100%, right? And I'm saying, I think it's more likely that I just happened to be right about any single one of these things. And it doesn't matter which one it is.
Yeah, but you're just
But you
speculating
are right
that
all
you
the
are
time.
about one thing. Like you're not actually showing that you're right about any of that. I could speculate a number of things, like Bigfoot was trouncing around in some kind of wooded area over here in the Smoky Mountains. There's a Bigfoot, and he's walking around, and he's paying a bunch of people to write sexualized novels about him. I mean, yeah.
Well, I mean, you would estimate the prior probability of that hypothesis in exactly the same way. You take the prior probability and you take expectedness of the evidence, right? And there you go. So that's it, right? And I mean, like, to be sure, when it comes to like different things in the Gospels that could like plausibly be true about Jesus, there are obviously different like levels of probabilities, right? So, for example, I don't think that Jesus was actually born in Bethlehem, right? That's like an easy one, right? But like for some other claims, like he was crucified. Actually, like there are even some examples specific where the mythicist interpretation is actually like super cringe, like for example in Mark 15 verse 21, Simon the Cyrene helps Jesus to carry the cross, and he's specifically identified as Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, right? Which is a very unusual way how to title someone, because normally the Greeks were identified by patronymikon, which was the name of their father, like Socrates to Sophroniscou, or Alexandros to Philippou, right? But you wouldn't identify someone by the names of their sons. Like for me, and again, there are going to be two interpretations. One of them is a historicist, and the other one is mythicist, right? The historicist is going to be, well, there was just like some guy, right? And the authors of the audience of the Gospel of Mark knew who that was. So, or they knew his sons. So the author just wrote, yeah, it's the dad of the two guys that you know, right? But on mythicism, the explanation is that the Simon of Cyrene actually refers to the Cyrenaic philosophical school. Alexander is a reference to Alexander the Great, and Rufus is the reference to Musonius Rufus, who was a Roman Stoic philosopher, right? All of that is, of course, completely ad hoc.
Camille,
but
come on.
Just
Camille, you're totally misrepresenting that. That's not actually minimal mythicism, Camille. You're totally misrepresenting. I know specifically you're misrepresenting that.
Then you need to bring in additional ad hoc explanations to explain away that.
No. You're totally misrepresenting it there, Camille. I mean, you're doing the exact same thing that other historicists have done. You've misrepresented it, because in Richard Carrier's work on the historicity of Jesus, he said that is the least likely explanation. So I when you say that you know mythicism more than me, or you know the minimal mythicist like position better than me, this just shows that that's not true. You don't.
What are some of the more probable ones?
I mean, I can't think of them right off the top of my head there, Camille. All I do remember.
Neither can I. Actually, I can think of one.
Hold on. I'm not done talking.
Yeah, sorry.
I remember this one specifically because it's been brought up that this is the most probable, or this is what mythicism says, but this is not what mythicism says. In fact, it is the least likely possible option for it. So I mean, I'm not going to get into an area that I haven't thoroughly researched and I don't remember right off the top of my head. I mean, I could look into it and I could get back to you.
Gentlemen.
So if I may,
Kamil,
Yeah.
if I may.
Yeah.
We've had quite a lot back and forth. You guys, I appreciate you guys and your demeanor. I know things got a little hot here and there, and I like that. That's good, and that's needed. I mean, when is Godless Engineer not involved and things don't get hot, right? Or at least somewhat. Look, you guys, seriously, I love this. I have so many questions myself, but this isn't my questions. This is going to be the audience. So I think we need to get into Q&A if that's okay with you guys.
Okay.
Sure.
All right, John, did you want to finish off? Because I know that Kamil had a lot of talk there. Did you want to end with a quick statement before we get into Q&A about your position and what you think, and then we'll just go to Q&A?
Well, okay. So ultimately, I feel like mythicism is very much falsifiable, regardless of what Kamil thinks about mythicism. And I still have yet to hear about a like a real tangible falsifiability criteria from Kamil about historicity. I tried to get to that, but all I got was kind of an ambiguous lower the prior probability of it and you'll disprove it kind of thing, which that doesn't make it all that tangible to me, at least, I guess. So,
okay.
Well,
hey, look, you guys disagree. Well, look, I know you're going to continue to disagree.
That's just basic reasoning. I don't know what to tell you. But
we're never going to stop, guys. We're never going to stop.
If Paul actually wrote that Jesus was crucified in the lower heaven, I know that like the early church was never preserved a passage like that. But if he actually found like a papyrus in the sands of Egypt, right, that said like Paul actually wrote, I think that Jesus never existed on earth, then I think like historicity would be more probably false than true, right? Or Peter even better. So you go. Like,
let me ask this first question. Sorry, I'm pushing forward, guys. We got a debate going on. I just want to help you guys keep going. Okay, so I'm going to ask John first. Here we have a question, and thank you for the super chat once again, Paul. I appreciate that. If Jesus was a celestial figure, how come Paul details the cross crucifixion, i.e. in Galatians?
Well, I mean, I guess I can test the idea about details. I mean, he says that Jesus, was crucified, and he does point out that he was crucified on a cross, but also in the Jewish mythology, I guess, the firmament, this very physical place, the lower heavens, just right on top of the firmament, it had copies of everything that existed on earth as well as like happened on earth. So crucifixion would have also been employed in the lower parts of the heavens on top of the firmament. And this is not ad hoc reasoning. If anybody wants to try to say that that's just ad hoc reasoning, because this is well defined in the Jewish scriptures, and the understanding in first century Christianity that the lower heavens was a physical place that contained copies of things, like perfect copies of things, of the things that are on earth.
Thank you. Kamil, can you respond to that?
I agree. It's not ad hoc. And I think, this is like a pretty typical question that gets asked to mythicists, probably by someone who like hasn't read Career or anything like that, right? Because really, when it comes to explaining the evidence, like the difference between historicity and mythicism is just like how many meters above sea level Jesus was crucified, right? So under mythicism or under historicity, early Christians believe that it was like the latitude of where Jerusalem is, right? And on mythicism, early Christians believed that it was higher than that. But Jesus had a physical body, there was a physical cross. But of course, there wasn't any like celestial pilot. There weren't any space Jews, unfortunately. It's just he was crucified by angels and by demons, Satan and his like demonic minions.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Next question, guys. And I'm just pressing forward. If I don't, I know you assholes, man. You won't stop. So I got to do it. I really do appreciate these super chats and, of course, your questions. Trude Hell says, why did the Christians, and either one of you on this one, I'd like for you to take up this question first and then someone follow up. Why did the Christians have to interpolate Jesus in Josephus' work if he was a historical character?
Because Josephus never mentioned Jesus, probably. So, and like they couldn't stomach it, so they just interpolated him. I think the James, the brother of Jesus, the one named Christ, I can very easily imagine that was just a gloss that got interpolated into the text. So that could have been like an honest mistake, right? That some like Christian scribe, or maybe Eusebius, just saw Jesus, brother of James, and James, brother of Jesus, and he wrote, "Oh, that must be Jesus, Jesus Christ," and then later copiers reincorporated it into the text. Yeah, but I think probably Josephus didn't mention Jesus.
I think John will agree with that. But
oh yeah, I do. I think that they invented the evidence in Josephus to give it like a historical bite, I guess. Because if Josephus mentioned him, then obviously he really existed in history or something like that. Which I guess by the 3rd or 4th century, which is most likely when it would have been inserted. I believe 3rd or 4th is when it was. Then I think that it just gives the religion more of a historical grounding, which is what they were looking for at the time.
Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate that. We have a question from, I can't even pronounce it. Thank you for the super chat, though. I really appreciate it. I'll try to pronounce it. Zerafa, I think. Did the fictional characters, e.g. Osiris, appear in a culture expecting a Messiah, as the Jews did? Would Jesus be relevant and agreeable if he supposedly came centuries or millennia ago? Thank you for that super chat.
Okay, I think that this is directed at me.
I'll keep it up so you guys can go back to the question if you need to.
Right. So this is exactly where syncretism comes in, and I would highly implore people to go and actually research what syncretism was, because you're basically pointing out here that the Isis and Osiris cult was different. They weren't expecting a Messiah and all this other stuff. But that's exactly what defines the Christian mystery cult religion, because the changing of things and merging with what was already expected in Judaism is exactly what you would expect to see out of syncretizing Judaism with the pagan religions that were in that particular area. So it's actually expected for it to be different. That's what mythicism says, is that Christianity was different than all of these other cults, but all these other cults, the ideas that were propagating through them, influenced those that first started the cult of Christianity.
Can you put up the question real quick?
Yeah, and let me reshare it real quick here. No, you're fine. I don't know why I thought, let me take it down. Here you go.
Yeah, I wanted to, would Jesus be relevant and agreeable if he supposedly claimed? That's a real good question, right? So I think if mythicism was true, we would probably have 4 different versions of Ascension of Isaiah, not 4 Gospels, right? Or even more, actually. Because the way how you normally innovate in Second Temple Judaism is that you forge a document, like a testament or vision or something like that, in the name of patriarchs, Adam, or some of the prophets, and you have them narrate an appearance of some angel or just a vision from God, where they are revealed some new theology, and you validate that new theology by having it forged in the name of someone who already has authority, because they are a character in the Old Testament, right? But what you don't see is Second Temple Jews innovating their theology by writing a gospel. Again, Jesus could be an exception, but we would need some evidence for that.
Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate that. Here we have a gentleman who has debated you before, Kamil. And Joel Pearson says, does this argument work with on OHJ's a judicator? I can't even pronounce that. Can you guys see that?
Yeah. That wasn't a debate. That was just
a discussion.
Discussion. It was very cordial. I would love to have it again. Yeah, I didn't want to rant about Richard Carrier, but here's my rant about Richard Carrier, right? So Richard Carrier is someone who I ironically thinks that we are talking about a guy who lived 2,000 years ago, and by his own admission, the evidence is not super strong in either way. But he thinks that the probability of that guy not existing is 99.992%, which means he thinks that minimal historicity is less probable than flipping a coin 13 times in a row, right? Like those kinds of numbers are achievable in physics, but not in history, right? Like if you are trying to determine how probable something is 2000 years ago, and you came up with that high number, that number itself should probably tell you that you did something wrong, right? Like he thinks that the posterior of 1 Thessalonians 2, 14 to 16 being authentic is 1 in 250,000, right? Which is like less probable than winning a coin flip 17 times in a row. Like, does he think that events from 2000 years ago that are like better attested than Jesus are even more probable than that? They are like 1 in billions and billions. Like Polybius has great sources. He's an amazing historian, and contemporary historians still dispute what he has to say, right? So yeah, that's my rant about Richard Carrier.
John, would you like to comment on that and then move on to another one?
Well, I think Richard Carrier coming to that conclusion for 1 Thessalonians was based on all of the evidence surrounding the fact that it was interpolated. So, I mean, I don't understand. Are you to mean that you have a problem with him assigning that kind of odds to that?
Well, yeah, just very quickly, like, so here's what Richard Carrier does. He gives some arguments, but then he says something like, I can't possibly imagine that the odds are better than 1 in 10,000. But he actually doesn't give any reasons for why the odds should be, let's say, 1 in 10,000 and not like 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100,000, right? It's just feelings. It's not based on any data. I would call it like Bayesian woo, where basically it gives this sense of rigor because you have actual formulas and numbers, but where exactly the ratios are set, like is it supposed to be 1 in 110,000 or 1 in 100,000? That's just based on feelings, right? It's not based on any real data. Yeah, he has arguments, but then like you have to put some number on it, and exactly what number you put doesn't have any justification. And if you are solving a math problem about how high someone is, and you come up with an answer that the person is 10 meters high, like that answer alone should give you some indication that you did something wrong. And it's, analogically,
well, I mean, Kamil, I really don't think that you have to be super exact like you're expecting it, but also I really don't see, like, I hear you complaining about Carrier somewhat speculating about these probabilities, but today in our discussion I only heard speculation from you about how likely it was that Jesus actually existed in history. I mean, you didn't give any kind of hard, super specific numbers either. I mean, maybe you have those numbers, but I mean, from our interaction here today, I just hear super speculative things without any kind of justification either. So I don't understand why you have such a problem with Carrier doing it. I say in quotations because I don't think that Carrier is all that Bayesian wooey, but
no,
you seem to think he is. But I don't see a difference between that and what you're doing here.
What I'm specifically arguing is that, for example, he thinks that the probability that 1 Thessalonians 2, 14 to 16 is authentic, the probability of interpolation, is 99.996%. I think, I'm ironically thinking that you are that confident about something that happened 2000 years ago that we eventually, like, ultimately can't, investigate, is like just blatantly ridiculous. Like that level of certainty is not achievable in ancient history,
No. That's saying that it's 100% would be ridiculous. Putting it at 99 point whatever percent is not ridiculous. That's just what he's saying is absolute certain. I mean, in Bayesian reasoning about historical events, there is going to be some number picking about, but that's also why in Carrier's book, he references two different, boundaries. He goes like for the best possible case for mythicism, but then he also argues a fortiori from the strongest position, giving historicity a lot of credence where he doesn't think that it really deserves it. But he also wants to represent like the best case for historicity and honestly come to a conclusion about the Bayesian probability or the Bayesian thought process on that.
Maybe we need to definitely someday get Dr. Carrier to come and join you, Kamil, because I know you're working on your PhD, and we talked about this in the past. So maybe he'll join you on some episode in the future.
Book me for 2027.
In 9 years from now. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, thank you for answering that, guys. Next question. Crossover Maniac says both Ned Ludd and John were believed to be real historical people within a generation of their creation. Why not the same for Jesus? So you guys know this argument. This is obviously, I believe, the cargo cults, and that was recent history mythologizing. If I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's why it's important to stick with ancient history, because different cultures, different literary cultural conventions, right? And yeah, John Frum was fictional, but actually, like a lot of these cargo cults, based their cult around Prince Philip, who actually existed. So there you go, right?
John?
Well, yeah, but Ned then explain Ned Ludd.
Different literary conventions, different cultures. Like it's
no.
I wouldn't. I wouldn't.
You can't just hide behind that, there, Camille.
No,
because Ned Ludd is not based on any historical figure whatsoever.
Sure, and again, Superman is not based on any historical character ever, right? All of the superheroes are not based on actual real people. Maybe James
Superman
Bond.
is real.
What do you mean?
My point is that the Luddites thought that Ned Ludd was a real person.
Sure, and what I'm saying is, like, there are differences between literary conventions in different cultures. So it's very, very, like, you have to be very, very careful about drawing, like, inferences outside the ancient world, which is exactly what we are discussing, right? Like, someone who's studying cults in Polynesia is not going to take evidence that's relevant to 17th century Sweden, right? And similarly, if you are investigating, and this is not just a question of historical Jesus, right? Like, when you are investigating events in the ancient past, you're not going to be drawing on evidence from like 1700s, from like Polynesia, you know. Maybe there are some exceptions, of course, to that, like historical demography and stuff like that. But generally, like, people work with a body of evidence that's like culturally homogeneous.
Well, okay.
Yeah, no, I was going to say this is an interesting question, guys and gals watching, because it does tie into the idea of, like, if Pontius Pilate's mentioned and we know he existed, did this guy Jesus? And this ties into some of that interesting stuff, even though that's ancient. So you guys can argue about that all day long. I guess we can move on to the next question if you guys are cool with that. So, all right, this is kind of a funny one. And I cannot pronounce your name. I apologize. Is John a real engineer? It's important we find this out. And this is all credential based. So are you really an engineer?
Is he really godless? That's the real question.
We've had a few questions saying, Kamil, you're not godless. They think you're a secret theist or something because you're arguing for Jesus.
So. Oh, shit. Shut this down. Shut this down.
So that's Uhan. He's a really good friend. And it's kind of an inside joke about how I'm not a real engineer. So I'm very much a real engineer.
Awesome. What is it? I got to ask, what do you do? What's your engineering?
I'm a software engineer. I got a master's in software engineering and a bachelor's in computer engineering.
Thank you so much. Everybody now knows. Awesome. I don't think Kamil has to say anything about that. Do you have any insight on this, Kamil? I'm just kidding.
I assume that you programmed the Crestus app, right?
Well, the one that's out there right now is actually developed prior to me, but I'm the one that got it working and updated. And I've since completely rewritten it in a new framework. So the one that is going to be going up soon the update that's coming up soon is all me.
I ask everybody, go in the description, of course, and make sure you guys check out the material. He made a cool app. Even Kamil got it to prep for this debate. So even if you're not a mythicist, it's good to know what they say and to understand the arguments. I always want to still man a position before I try to challenge or come up with the idea. And so I really do appreciate the cordial discussion, guys. You guys came close to getting a little heated, but really do respect you guys. So hit that like button. Michael Poole $5 super chat. Thank you. No question today. Just thanks to MythVision for these respectful debates. And that's why I mentioned thank you guys, because I know for a fact things can get heated really quick, but you guys did move on with that. And I appreciate you guys keeping your emotions under control in light of.
I've got nothing but love for Kamil.
Likewise. I'm not a Christian, but I do consider you a brother.
I'm used to saying that all the time too. Guys, if you could pronounce his name, I would obviously just give you the super chat, myself. But how would mythicism account for other characters described to Jesus? I.e., would Pontius Pilate only live in Gospels or in history over Judea? Or, I don't know, do you guys understand that question?
Well, so I feel like they're asking, how does mythicism account for other characters?
It kind of goes into that John Ludd or the Ludd. It kind of makes me think, if John the Baptist exists, why didn't Jesus? I mean, the characters that are right there, you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, but I mean, I feel like, that's akin to the Spider-Man argument, I mean, we know New York exists. We know all these other things in New York exist. So therefore Spider-Man exists. I think that mythicism definitely admits that there were historical characters that were used in the generation of the later Gospels. But as far as stepping into the first Christian's boots, meaning Paul's boots, as far as we know what Christianity looked like in the 50s, Jesus doesn't interact with anybody like in history. Like, he interacts with the apostles, but only through visions and through them reading the scriptures. So, I mean, Jesus doesn't interact with anybody like historically.
Kamil, do you want to comment on that, or go ahead and move to the next question?
Yeah, I think it was for John mostly, so I think we are good.
Okay, cool. Dildo Baggins, thank you for the two. Thanks a lot. That's an awesome name. What made he decide on mythicism? So I think obviously there's a language barrier here, but you understand, and I think this is actually directed to you, John.
It's hard to believe there's a language barrier with a name like Dildo Baggins, but okay. Oh, he is. He's okay. He's from GE. Well, so what led me to the conclusion that Jesus probably didn't exist was that, I got into arguments on Facebook in Facebook groups about, Jesus existing. And so I thought, surely there's solid evidence that Jesus existed. I mean, in my app that it seems like most everybody has here, there's actually a section called precedence. I can't remember what it's precedence in something. But in it, I've actually got a list of all the different historical figures that Jesus is regularly compared to as far as being said to have more documentation about, his existence. But when you actually compare the two, you compare Jesus to these, at least the evidence that we have for him, you'll find that all the other historical figures that are normally compared to Jesus have more historical information for them than Jesus does. And the evidence that Jesus does is very ambiguous and doesn't solidly place Jesus here on earth. So I tried to be as objective as I could about it, looking at it, trying to find evidence that would solidly convince me that he definitely did exist in history. Like, for instance, with Pilate, there's the Pilate stone, but there's also references in Josephus and these other places that definitely place Pilate in history. But we don't have any of that for Jesus. So I came away from, looking into the actual evidence for Jesus, being very unconvinced that he actually existed.
I must say, I know a guy who thinks Pontius Pilate did not exist, but he goes so far. We'll leave that be. So thank you all for the questions. I didn't get many at MythVisions that didn't super chat, so all I saw were the glowy super chat questions. I'll go ahead and let you guys close. That we've already gone an hour and 48 minutes. You're on vacation, John. Let's do this again. Kamil, obviously, thank you so much for joining, and I'm going to go ahead and allow who went first? Kamil, you went first?
Can I just ask a question? Can I drop a link to a Discord chat for an after show?
All day, bro. Absolutely.
Okay, cool. So as soon as we are done, go here, and we usually hang out in
I'm gonna give
voice
you
chat
5
alpha.
minutes. I'm gonna give you 5 minutes closing. Everybody, check out the link that Kamil is giving in here in the comments. You guys can go to the after show and hear the discussion after, and hang out if you want to in his Discord. And I know John probably has a Discord, but you're on vacation, bro. I don't know if you're hanging out and doing any of that. So, all right, Kamil, you'll go first because you actually went first. No, you went second in this show, didn't you? No, you went first. Sorry.
Yeah, Kamil went first, so he can go first on the exit.
All right, John, you'll go after him, and we'll close. Ladies and gentlemen, hit that like button.
Okay, yeah. So I would basically just reiterate what I was just talking about, right? So it's important that we are not defending Jesus of faith. We are defending just the idea that there was a guy, he got killed, people were excited. Happens all the time, right? And again, like I'm not super 100%, or I'm not 99.9996% confident about it, right? I'm just much less within the range of what I think is super like reasonable when we are talking about events that are 2000 years gone, right? And again, like when we evaluate hypotheses, there are two components, prior probability and expectedness. Prior probability is super low, right? And then I think the evidence is mostly ambiguous. There isn't any silver bullet. But the point is that essentially John needs to get his particular interpretation of the evidence right every single time. And if he is wrong only once about an interpretation of a Pauline passage or some like mundane detail about Jesus's life in the Gospels, then mythicism is gone. It's toast, right? But that's not the case for me, right? All I need for Jesus to exist is just to happen to be right once. And I don't even have to know which piece of evidence I'm right about, right? And let's just say that I'm more confident, even though we'll never know for sure because we don't have time machine, I'm more confident that I happen to be right at least once, then I'm confident that a mythicist is right every single time about so many different passages, sources, and so on. And we were talking a lot about evidence. So again, just I want to reiterate, there isn't like a single bullet in favor of mythicism or a single bullet in favor of historicity, but that usually isn't a problem in ancient, when we do ancient history, right? Like there are all kinds of figures, for example, who are first mentioned in Suidas. That's a Byzantine encyclopedia from the 10th century, which means that they are actually first attested in ancient sources about 1,000 years, in some cases much more, than they supposedly lived, right? And we don't normally doubt that they existed, even though the evidence is actually really shitty. Like imagine if Jesus was first mentioned not, 50 years after he supposedly lived, but actually 1,000 years after he supposedly lived. That would be really bad evidence, right? But actually, like there are all kinds of ancient figures that are in a much worse situation, and historians still have no problem thinking that they probably existed. They were just some guy, right? And really the only exception, and this is what I was trying to hit hard today, what's really, really important when you think about how probable it is that someone existed specifically in ancient Greek, Jewish, and Roman literature is when he is depicted as living, right? Because all of the dying and rising gods, all of the rank Raglan heroes, and all of people like this, they are universally, I would say almost, depicted as living in like this extremely distant sort of pre-archaic age where the world is not really clearly established and all kinds of amazing things can happen, right? But that's not the case for Jesus. I think if mythicism was true and Jesus didn't exist, then we wouldn't have, for example, 4 Gospels, right? We wouldn't even have the letters of Paul, where we have so many candidates where it seems like Paul could be just talking about a guy who was believed to come out of a seed of David, had a mom, had a biological brother, broke bread with his disciples the night before he was handed over, or when he was handed over, right? I think we would just have different versions of myths that would either place Jesus in a very distant past, or we would have basically 4 different versions of ascension of Isaiah, right? Which means someone would forge an account in the name of some patriarch or some New Testament prophet, Old Testament prophet, and there would be a divine being or just the word of God that would tell the people the innovation that actually God sent an angel to be killed to atone for the sins of Israel. And I think that's about 5 minutes, right?
Yep, 30
So
seconds out.
Yeah, thanks for your attention. It was really fun.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Let's get John on here, and then we'll do closing here. Hold on. Go ahead, John. You're on, brother.
Well, I really appreciate Kamil coming on here to have this discussion or debate with me. I really appreciate Derek for thinking of me for this debate. Ultimately, I just don't see the evidence that places Jesus in history, even not maybe not solidly places him in history, but just makes it more likely than not. I don't see the evidence out there that suggests that. I think that the prior probabilities that have been discussed in this debate, while somewhat seem to be a bit speculative as far as what the exact probabilities would be, I think that the way that Carrier does it, being that he argues, the upper and lower bounds of it, and coming to the conclusion that historicity is I think a 33% chance of being true. I feel like he definitely accounts for a wide range of different possibilities, and still comes out on the side of, overwhelmingly not being a real person. And in this debate, I didn't really hear a good falsifiability criteria. I feel like I provided a very tangible falsifiability criteria, being that you would just need a reference, an independent reference that solidly placed Jesus as existing and living on earth, rather than only referencing him as a celestial figure in all of the unambiguous verses and uninterpolated verses. I feel like, requiring that does mean that it only takes one piece of evidence to disprove mythicism, but also the fact that mythicism is parsimonious with the evidence that we currently have is not a knock against it. It's really kind of mind-blowing to come into this debate and have parsimony be used as a negative against mythicism. Normally, the claim is that mythicism is not parsimonious with the evidence that we have, but it seems like in this debate, parsimony is actually a negative, in that, if mythicism can explain like all of these things that we can find, that means it's unfalsifiable, which it's not. I like I said, I still didn't hear a tangible, criteria for falsifiability on historicity. The main thing that I heard in this debate was just that, everything that mythicism can explain, historicity can explain as well, which I would think that there being no authentic references to Jesus, existing here on earth, would be a very much a knock against the idea that he was a historical person. I would not that it solidly disproves it. That's not at all what we're asking here. No mythicist is asking for a 99.9996% certainty that Jesus didn't exist or did exist. We're not asking for that. What we're asking for is evidence that sways that sways everything in the historicist direction, that makes it more likely than not that Jesus existed. That's what we require. And the fact that Kamil's hypothesis here doesn't really have a tangible way to falsify it is very troublesome to me as far as a historical hypothesis goes. So ultimately, I'm unconvinced. I remain unconvinced by this debate. I'm not sure if anybody here was convinced by Kamil or myself, but I just want to implore everybody to either get my app, the Crestus app, which is reasonably priced considering all of the different books that you'd have to buy in order to get the same information. But if you're not going to buy my app, go directly for the books. I know Carrier just recently put out a book called Jesus from Outer Space, where in a very pop level way, he has laid out the mythicist hypothesis, and you can go and read it for yourself. I didn't bring it with me, but it looks like it's a pretty short read, especially compared to On the Historicity of Jesus. But just read the hypothesis for yourself. Read the minimal hypothesis case and make the decision for yourself. I know that plenty of you are going to be not persuaded, no matter how much evidence can be brought your way, but just, reading the actual information and coming to your own conclusion is all that I ever expect out of anybody. And just to reiterate, I'm really, really glad Kamil had the discussion and debate with me. And thank you so much, Derek, for allowing me to come on to the MythVision podcast channel yet again. And I can't wait for the next debate.
Dude, you guys are awesome. Here's that book he's talking about, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, Dr. Richard Carrier wrote this book. He made it more for general public, if you will. And there's newer material in there that wasn't in On the Historicity. Dr. Price told me he enjoyed this one. He had never read On the Historicity. How can Dr. Robert M. Price, being a mythicist, not have read OHJ? Anyway, I really appreciate all of you guys for the super chats, for the likes, for all of the compliments and the controversy in the comment section, heating things up for these guests that obviously went back and forth. You guys did great. Let's do this again sometime. And, I'm hunting people who are interested in doing debates like this and being cordial. You guys were really, really awesome. I have so many more questions. I'd love to ask you guys, what the strongest argument you think for the opposing side is and all that good stuff. Let's do this again. Let's hold our breath and make something happen again in the future. So does that sound good? Sounds good.
I mean, I'm definitely down for it. So I'm always down for a discussion on how Jesus probably didn't exist.
Awesome. I was actually proud of you. I'm glad that you just drank beer today too, John, instead of you're muted too. But no,
I have vodka, obviously.
You guys rock. Look, ladies and gentlemen, go check out their channels in the description. Every way possible to help. You can become a patron. I've got, no joke, over 100 to 150 videos that I have not released to the public on YouTube of Dr. Price and all sorts of different stuff. XJW material, you name it. You guys go over there, join the Patreon. It's like $3 a month, and you can access all of that. I really do appreciate that. And never forget, John, Kamil, and everybody watching, we are MythVision.